Yeah, hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We are very excited to host this webinar this evening, exploring the figure. And it's a conversation around 4 South African modernist artists, Maggie, Laubser, George Pemba, Gerard Sekoto, and Irma. I want to welcome you and thank you for being here. My name is Leyde. I'm a researcher, writer, and cataloguer at Strauss & Company. But I just want to give some context, I think, for why we're doing this panel over our sale time and why we're exploring the figure today in this way before I introduce our lovely panelists that are joining us. So figuration, I believe, is a powerful conceptual thread that links historical, traditional, and modernist and contemporary art in Africa. And at the moment, particularly in the contemporary scene, there's a strong figurative synergy with African art. A lot of people say that African art is synonymous with the figure. And there's a strong focus on figurative art in art making. And in February this year, over the Cape Town Art Fair, we created a non-commercial exhibition exploring this theme that focused on it. We had 75 artists on the exhibition from all over the continent. And the aim of the exhibit really was to highlight how the figure in art has been a strong component of many artists' work in African art history. And the ways we did that is we sort of juxtaposed artwork like Irma Stern's Dakar Woman against Zonele Mohole's series of works like this one, which really feature an interesting conversations whilst using similar formalizations, even though the one is a photograph and the one is a painting in different eras. We also wanted to look at the fact that the figure and art in Africa can be dated as far back at least as 150 years ago. And whilst never being hegemonic in style, it is an interesting way in which to further unpack the work of the continent as a theme. So particularly as contemporary artists are referring back to traditional artwork and referencing the past in their work for various different reasons, just like this Debbie Bell is talking to artworks and material culture from museums from Western Central Africa, like you can see on the left. And the exhibition also looked at major influences on the contemporary scene through the modernists and the greats like Ernest Mancoba, Gerard Sekoto, and Ben Nwanwu, just to name a few, and they were also represented. So this panel is really talking to a session that we are having coming up on Tuesday, the 5th of April at 6 p.m. It's part of a grand marquee sale, our first big sale of the year at Strauss. And it's really a nod to the theme, using the works on the sale as an extension really of this theme. And if you visit our Matterport exhibition and our e-catalogs via our website, you will see a series of the session. You will see it curated and you will be able to see the further expansion of how we've explored it. We are only going to focus on 4 artists from the session today, just because we can't talk about everything in 45 minutes. But you will see how we jump from past to present quite a lot. And here's an example. We have Dorothy Kay's Boxer with Amir Champlin, as well as a Francois Kruger, 2 bathers. And these are all at the moment exhibited together in the exhibition. And it's alluding to a deeper historical connect of the theme and context of the theme. And kind of, in a way, I think the way it's curated creates a lining up of historical, modern, contemporary in a new and different way. Some other quick examples are Penny Siopis with Tanya Peterson. This is an early Penny Siopis, 1986 to 1987, while the Tanya Peterson is 2016. but both female artists working with figure in very unique and different ways. We also have Eduardo Villa speaking to Cyrus Kubiro's stargazing, sculptural masks in a way in his Macho Nin series, which in Swahili means many faces. As a Kenyan artist, that's 2 beautiful works on the sale. So there's a lot of variety in this theme of figuration. So we thought it fitting to accompany the theme of past and present by inviting 4 exceptional contemporary artist practitioners, really, that are here today to discuss 4 very important South African modernists, and then further explore the theme to include more examples from the continent. You can just see from the range of examples that I've provided just how diverse the range of figuration can actually be. And the artworks, well, they're so diverse in this session, and the panelists on this talk are here really to further substantiate the diversity of making on the continent. And by looking at just 4 artists, we can compare so much variety, and I think that's really what this talk today is about. So before we really begin to unpack Laubser, Pemba, Sekoto, and Stern, I first want to formally introduce our panelists. So first is Dana Endundo Ferreira, the founder and CEO of Pavilion 54, a new one-stop digital platform and community around modern and contemporary art from Africa and the diaspora. Anelisa Mangcu is a curator and interdisciplinary art practitioner based in Cape Town. Mangcu is the co-founder of Under the Aegis, offers curatorial and art advisory services, and produces exhibitions and facilitates relationships between artists, collectors, and institutional collections from African continent and the diaspora. She's also a graduate of the Michaelis School in the curatorship for the Center for the Curating under Pippa Scottness at the time. Then we have Montague Hermann, who founded Montague Contemporary in 2019 and is passionate about contemporary art, African art, and recognizes the importance of changing the narrative of African art and building a new shared counter history. And then as a leading expert in contemporary art from Africa and the diaspora, Kimberley Cunningham combines her curatorial and advisory roles to create a new model through which to champion art from the continent and beyond. And so those are brief introductions that only give a tiny layer of what you all do for the art community, but I want to welcome you all and thank you all for being here today. So Dana, I want to start with you and welcome, first of all, and thank you for joining us. If you can just press unmute and make sure we can have the discussion. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to talk to you about an artist that is quite dear to my heart, Maggie Laubser, who produced work in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She traveled mostly within the confines of South Africa. And I think as an artist, she is greatly underappreciated, and especially considering how much dignity and respect she imbued on her sitters. Like, for example, this work, she had a brief visit to KZN where she painted the community, Indian community, largely women. And this one was done at the beginning of that period. And I just think is an extraordinary example and beautifully painted. She also, we have this beautiful work from her Langebaan period, Portrait of a Woman. And I just love the way you get a capturing as if you're sort of close-up view, almost like a camera view, but it's a painting where she's cut the head and the bottom, but you've got this pensive moment that you feel like you're intruding on. And we also have some of her formal sketches and studies that you can see her preparations and thoughts within how she was going to position her subjects. So Dana, as a contemporary and modernist specialist, really, please tell me what's your take on the Laubser works in Oseo or Laubser as a whole?
Thank you, Leigh, for this introduction and for everything. I must say, I'm like you, I'm quite a fan of Maggie Laubser and her work. I think it's very interesting and different. What I like about it is also that something you mentioned, she traveled a lot within South Africa, but also she traveled a lot toward Europe in her early years. And I think that it's interesting to see how this influence of this European influence has impacted her work. And I think that it's important to note that Maggie was one of the artists that introduced modernism and expressionism to South Africa, which breaking away completely from the traditional aesthetic that was around at the time. And this is something to be made. So when you talk about being underrated, I think it's also like at the beginning, she faced a lot of criticism because it was something new, it was something different, and usually people are not so inclined to change. But throughout the various decades that she worked, she managed together with other artists, including Irma, which you're going to talk about later, I think. They managed to establish new aesthetic and new forms of art into the landscape. So I think it's a very important character in the art scene, in the South African and African art scene. And I definitely hope to see more of it. And I do think that the works that you're presenting in the sales are pretty amazing, are very diverse, and show a wide range of like the different things that she has done throughout her career. So that's very interesting. This is an artist that I really like, and I will be following the sale very closely.
Great. I'm hoping she does very well as well. She deserves it. She's very much seen as a South African modernist, and those that are tuned in and know about modernism and us at Strauss certainly know her name. But there are a lot of modernists or that modernism period artists across the continent that we would love you to speak on and talk to. So who could we also look to as important African modernists?
Sure. So I was thinking about it, and definitely South Africa has always been a very important market in the African art scene in general on the continent and internationally. But I think it's interesting to look at also the similarities and the differences that occurred at more or less the same time throughout the continent and the different styles. So just wanted to speak of a few modernists that are more or less in the same area as Maggie and the other artists that we are featuring in the sales, and just give a little bit of like different flavors from the continent, starting with Abdel El Ghazar, who was Egyptian. So let's start from the north. For those who don't know, Abdel was a founding member of the contemporary art group in Egypt. He pioneered the development of modern Egyptian art, so something similar with Maggie. And he used to use in his work a mix of Egyptian cultural and artistic tradition and folk symbol together along with a religious belief. Many of his work function as a social critic with the focus on the poor and the distressed in the Egyptian society, an emphasis that actually caused him to be in disfavor of the monarchy at the time before the revolution in Egypt. And that changed when Nasser took over the power, and he actually became a very prominent Egyptian modernist at the time. So this is very interesting. In this painting in particular, which is called Man and a Cat, El Ghazar is depicting the art critic Aimé Azar wearing a traditional black outfit with hieroglyphic symbol, and gaze and exaggerated features are echoed with the cat alongside him. So he's using those elements from the country's history and culture and mystical tradition, like the hieroglyph, to make it a distinctive Egyptian identity, to give it a distinctive Egyptian identity. In the next one, which is by Aina Onabulu, he's actually regarded as the father of modern Nigerian art. He initially learned to draw by copying just illustration and photograph from European magazines and books. And from 1901, he started like producing realistic portraits of cultural and political elites in Lagos, which actually caught the attention of some British colonial administrator who refused to believe that an African artist with no formal training could produce such work. So by appropriating some of the European academic convention, Onabulu was challenging the racist ideology of the British imperialism and deliberately breaking from the indigenous tradition. So also someone that was kind of like changing a little bit the way people were thinking about art. If we move on to the next one, who is Afie Kong, who's also from Nigeria. She was one of the first galleries and art patron, but she was also a painter who studied in England. So someone who has traveled and was also exposed to different forms of art. And if we can look at this painting, you can see that the bright colors and bold and expressionist, you can also recognize an expressionist brushwork in her painting. And she also has a lot of attention to the dress and the textile. Both women in the painting are wearing Yoruba ensemble. So she was also bringing that Nigerian cultural element while using European technique. The next one is Geoffrey Mukasa, who's from Uganda. So the story behind it is like, he was born into an influential Ugandan family. And so he was living pretty much in privilege until the Amindada coup d'etat in Uganda, where his father was killed and he had to go into exile. During that time, he studied in India in the early 80s, and he was particularly inspired by the Indian figurative painters and also embraced European tradition of expressionism and cubism. Which we give them a singular feel in his work. So he has a very distorted perspective and saturated colors in his painting, and he often depicts scenes of everyday lives. The next artist I want to talk about is George Lilanga, who's from Tanzania. Also prominent, who has gained international recognition over the years. And in this work, you can usually clearly see the influence of the Makonde culture, the Makonde ethnic, combined with the surreal feel to it. He showed his, he's also traveled and has been exposed internationally in New York and Washington, D.C., for example, and even Keith Haring later acknowledged the impact of his work made on his graffiti art. And typical of his iconography are the tangled figure depicted, like you can see in this image here. They are often said to resemble the Shetani, which is like an evil spirit in the Makonde mythology. But their exuberance and dynamism echoing like some dance of another tribe in Tanzania. So it's all mixing those different cultures from where it's from to make it something visually very distinctive. The next artist is Ahmed Ouais, who's also from Egypt, so a different culture, more close to the Middle Eastern influences. And actually, Oasis wanted to recalibrate Middle Eastern practice in a post-world and very surrealist, post-surrealist art world. Much of his work embodies the working class struggle in Egypt, and his painting styles often features large muscular bodies enclosed within a tight confine of the canvas, as you can see in this painting, where he's depicting the General Nasser, who was like a president of Egypt, like before he was president, and when he was calling for the repossession of the Canal Suez in Egypt during the revolution. The next artist, moving on to Central Africa, this one, from DRC, and this is where I am actually from. And we're talking about Ndamvu Peso, who was also an artist, like in the pure sense of like modernism, and in a very realistic style, often depicting scenes of like everyday scenes of life, but like in the village or in the cities, and doing a lot of portraits. It was actually very much had a lot of recognition in Congo during the time. Mobutu, the general, like the Marshal Mobutu, who was the president of Congo for, like the dictator of Congo, what should I say, for decades, was actually a big supporter and had many of his art, which also allowed him to gain popularity and to create art for a lot of the institutions in the country. So this is very typical figurative modernist style of Africa, which is very popular in Central Africa. The next artist, Kofi Atubam from Ghana, is also one of the most influential modern artists, and is usually celebrated for a narrative scene of Ghanaian life and village culture. He also studied in London, so was exposed to European influence, but he held a strong belief that African artists should utilize their art training to depict African cultures and tradition. And as such, like, he pioneered the use of Indikra symbol in its art. After the independence, to get like similar to Ndamvu, he was also appointed state artist by Kwame Nkrumah, and also did a lot of work for the state, and was very well recognized in the country. In the next one, and to change also a different style, still from Central Africa, and it's a style that has been very popular and very popular internationally. This is from Chibumba Kangamuta, who has a style that is very characteristic of the Zaire School of Popular Painting, which is a movement that has gained a lot of popularities with artists such as Chéri Samba, Moke, or Chéri Chérin, which are known internationally. But Kangamuta's works differ in his focus. He's focused usually on scenes from the independence of Congo from the Belgian colonialism and the struggle that happened before and after it. And actually, the anthropologist Johannes Fabian commissioned him in the 70s, in 73 and 74, to paint a comprehensive history of the Congo, which comprises of 101 different works that depict the struggle that Congolese had to endure during the colonization, the part of the colonization, like in the history. So it's very interesting because his work is part of like show a very important history, like part of the history of Central Africa and of Congo. And finally, I just want to go a little northeast with Salah El Mour from Sudan, who's also very well known and very recognized. And for him, the story that his family had a photography studio in Khartoum that closed, but definitely the setting of this photograph studio provided an ongoing inspiration for his work. He did a lot of portraits that many depict the full-length figure of individuals, duos, or even groups, framed with the typical studio props, again, that influence from his young age. In some works, however, the straightforwardly representation gives away a more surreal vision. Like in this one, you can see a three-headed protagonist. And for him, that was, and this is something that he does quite often in this work, and for him, this is a way to reveal multiple expressions and narrative moments within one image, something that as a photographer, he could not do, but that he can he's allowed to do in paintings. So that's it, to give a little bit of like an overview of some different artists and modernists throughout the continent. But I think what is interesting to note is in all of them, you can definitely discern a strong will and ability to fuse indigenous traditions and aesthetic with those of Western techniques and conventions. So there's also a strong will of representation. I think here we talk about figuration, and it's usually like interpretation or like showing what's happening like in the world. And I think that because Africa has been not exposed for so long to the rest of the world, and has not felt like that representation, and has not felt that documentation around Africa, I think figuratism was a way for African artists to also reclaim that narrative and tell their story and document their history in different ways. So it's interesting to see those similarities happening throughout the continent with different aesthetic, with different histories, with different cultures and different ethnies, but all together.
Wow, thanks, Dana. Your knowledge of the continent's modernists is so extensive, and to just get that snapshot into some of the artists, some of which I've never heard of, and it's just such a treat for a South African audience. I really appreciate it. It really broadens our horizons. And I also think I just need to ask you, when you look at the work that's being produced now from the contemporary scene, and then you look at all these modernists exploring the figure for a long historical time, what is your feelings about figuration being seen as a fad when looking at the work on the continent?
I would say I definitely do not agree that it's a fad. I think to call it a trend already is kind of like wrong or a mistake, because it's not a trend. Or if it's a trend that has been going on for over 100 years at least. So this is, I think, is just part of like how Africans want to express themselves. I don't think it's not going anywhere. There will always be a will for people to kind of represent what they see, reinvent and depict what they see around them. And especially like in this time of like this changing time and this globalized world where Africans are actually exposed to more things, but they still will want to interpret it in a way that speaks to them. So, and actually we can see like it's happening. And I think it's not that there's a trend towards figuratism now. I think it's just that African art in general is been more exposed and it's been more presented, and people are discovering it, but it's always been there. And I think it's there to stay.
Yes, exactly. And I think that it's really important that we give the historical context in more depth to the greater world. And I love how you've reiterated exactly what we wanted to say with our session and also our previous exhibition, which is that each person has interpreted what modernism and figuration is and individualized it and used their individual creativity to make something extraordinarily different. No one artist you've covered dealt with it in the same way, but they're all seen as important modernists, which is a really powerful way to hit home on that point. And I hope this research leads to much more interest, and your sharing helps our research team as well. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I'm moving on now to our next panelist, Annalisa. Welcome. I've asked you to speak to work on our sale by George Pemba. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, I'm really excited to speak about Pemba's work. I have various reasons why I'm particularly interested in this artist, but I think the most important one is because I just recently explored figuration as a theme in an exhibition with my co-curator, Yana Blanche, last year.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
Having been able to attend the preview of the auction and the works presented at the auction yesterday allowed me just to look at the kind of themes that are being engaged with. So yeah, I'm excited to look into figuration. And that was an incredible presentation. Oh my goodness, I've learned so much. As you were speaking, I was writing some notes on my little book, so thank you for that.
I think that if we look at Pemba's work before we go on to, I do want to ask you some questions about your exhibition. With over 7 decades of work that focuses on Black life during apartheid, Pemba is an extremely important artist in my opinion. And I argue one that highly influences contemporary artists in South Africa. This work, Figure Reading Beside a Street, is one of the works on our sale. And it just shows that through the adoption of a medium and stylistic trains of modernism, just like what Dana was saying, Pemba was unique insofar as using it in a manner that at first glance, it seems mundane, the scene. But then when you look more, there's an extreme political or social statement, particularly in this one, for me, in the bus, which is also on our sale, while still giving humanism to the subjects in his works. This work is talking about commuting between spaces where people were forcibly removed because of their skin color and moved into spaces where they had to work for white communities. And so just that simple bus scene says so much to South Africans. And there's been artists like Santuma Fukeng who have done bodies of photography work like based on that in the 80s. And here Pemba was talking about it already as far back as in the 40s. And I want you to just reflect, if you can, Annalisa, on just these three works and what you feel about them and how they speak to you as a contemporary practitioner.
I mean, I think if we think about Pemba, his work primarily unpacked various themes around fear, loss, joy, cultural traditions, religion, tensions within the home, lack of certain family members within the home, lack of employment. And so when I look at these three specific works, I mean, I really did write points because I think it's so important to highlight these very different things that he was touching on. Was grandma and child, you know, during the apartheid era, or rather the kind of view that people had of Black people during the apartheid era was that of chaos and destruction. But with this particular work, Grandma and Child, I think it brings a level of silence, a human moment, a moment of not just depicting normal life, but also just depicting intimacy and love and maybe even leisure. You know, often when we see these works by these great modernists, we often associate it with trying times or times of hardship. But I think this moment is purely just an image of a grandmother and her grandkid or child, allowing for an artist to really document them and to almost archive that very moment. And I think in its own, that's a form of resistance. I think sometimes just being leisurely and just being is often something that is not encouraged when it comes to Black artists. There always has to be something that's quite political. And I think often when one's doing the opposite, that in its own is a resistance. And then Figure Reading Beside a Street. Yeah, for me, that's a different depiction of township life. There are obviously certain areas that do look like that, but not all the areas. And I think it gives you a certain perspective of maybe what township life could have looked like at the time. But I find that what is missing are very important things, conversations around like having solid houses or, you know, proper infrastructure, like a solid street and a traffic circle, trees, maybe if there has to be an indication of like industrial areas that's far back. There's a particular work of Pemba's that was created in 1977. It's called New Brighton, which is where I'm from. And when I look at that piece, it feels like a far truer depiction of township life, or at least my understanding of township life. There hasn't been like much development when it comes to the space within the location, in terms of like the kinds of homes that are there or just the general infrastructure. And so I can kind of make the connection to the kind of scenes created in 1977 to now, and definitely that feeling that you get being in the township where people don't necessarily have high walls, so neighbors are communicating, engaging, interacting with one another. There's like a vibrant energy in the streets. And I think his complementary colors in that particular piece, I just thought of it. Sorry, I didn't actually send it to you so we could have it as a part of this presentation. But the complementary colors, I think, were then intentional to create that kind of sense of movement and vibrancy. And so when I look at this work, it feels slightly sad for some reason, because I think I'm not sure if it was intentional for Pemba, but I feel like the title says figure reading beside a street, but for some reason your eye goes straight to, I think, the houses and the women maybe doing their laundry, and not necessarily the individual on the far left, or rather in the foreground, sitting and reading. And I think those are maybe sometimes certain things that people don't necessarily associate to people in the township. And I think part of his work was not to just paint portrait works of people in groups or referencing some kind of religious topics, but also just to make commentary just on general social life, and maybe to even kind of lift the lid in terms of people's perceptions of Black people within township infrastructures, maybe the perception that they're less knowledgeable or uneducated. And again, I think that on its own is a resistance, or is part of resistance art. Within the bus, yeah, this particular scene is incredibly morbid. You see a kid on the left looking at their father or uncle or father figure, wanting this individual to look happy, but you can see there's an incredible pain in their heart, or in their spirit. And then on the far right, your eye kind of centers into the women who are in conversation. But again, that is an important moment that needed to be captured. And again, there is social commentary being made, but we don't know if people are going to work or if they are going home. During the apartheid era, at any point, there would be police raiding a bus. So you don't know if they're carrying some form of tension. Are we going to get home safely? Are one of us going to be arrested? Or if it's a kid looking extremely tired because when it came to the apartheid era, it definitely was required for people to go from home all the way into the city area where there was predominantly employment. And so children having to kind of wake up really early, earlier than most people do, to get to school on time so that their parents or caretakers would then be able to go to work on time, is part of the story. And I think that's what's so beautiful about Pemba, is that the more research you do in the time that the works were created, allows you to do further research into the kind of context of those particular works.
No, exactly. And I think it's also quite interesting as a South African to know that these commutes are still happening and are still very relevant to people's lives now. So this work speaks in a contemporary setting in some ways. And I agree with you, holds a very strong social commentary that moves me greatly. Can we move on to talking about what you've recently founded, Under the Aegis? And under this capacity in particular, I want you to talk about an extraordinary exhibition that you held last year that focused on Black figuration. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that project and why you wanted to do it?
So we felt, and when I say we, it's myself and my co-curator for the exhibition, Janette Blanche, really were approached by Maggie, the founder and owner of Art Joburg and the fair F&B Art Joburg, to look into Black figuration. And we wanted to kind of steer away from conversations around pain, hardships, any kind of work that really lends itself to some kind of political nuances. We really wanted to look at leisure, relaxation, daily life, joy, Black people just being, and also allowing for the Black artists that we had approached to depict themselves and their people in the most authentic way. So by no means were we trying to reinvent the wheel. Black portraiture is definitely something that has been explored many times all over the world, but we just felt that we wanted it, or rather wanted to explore the theme in a very tangible way in South Africa. but then again, it wouldn't be a purely African exhibition if we didn't kind of travel around and engage with people and try draw works from people all over the continent. Unfortunately, we just didn't have enough time to engage with people in East Africa, so it doesn't feel like a full depiction. But again, we just wanted to be able to explore the theme and bring enough works in a tangible way to Johannesburg, which is definitely the city that's in the forefront of kind of urban discussions. So we kind of engage with a lot of artists from West Africa and South Africa and North Africa. And a lot of the artists were so giving and so generous. So we were able to have about, I think, on the walls, maybe close to like 30 works, but in actual fact, we had 52 works in that exhibition and try to rotate as much as possible. But we just felt it was really important for them to have conversations that they wanted to have. And we didn't want anything that felt too political. And so we came up with the theme, everything was beautiful and nothing hurt. And we felt that that lent itself to a more easy on the ear kind of theme for the exhibition. And it really allowed for the artists to decide what it is that they wanted to put forward for the exhibition. So it was really great. You had works like Mongezi Gum, who's I think works on the other slide, that I feel draw a lot of inspiration and connection to Pemba's works. Gum was born in 1970, so he definitely was inspired by Pemba, and I think really looking into township scenes. These two works are charcoal on paper, but you can see similar scenes in the township. I mean, you can't really even tell if it's in the township. I think if you know the artist, then you know he draws a lot of inspiration from where he lives, which is Lilanga, which is in Cape Town, a township in Cape Town, one of the oldest ones. But what you see in these images are just Black people being, dancing, joyful, someone playing the saxophone, young men playing soccer, the community cheering, engaging. And that's what I think we wanted to lean more towards, positive scenes in the township, things that people can see anywhere, to be honest, and not really centering the site per se, and rather having people look at the individuals in the scene. And then in the next slide, yes, this is Adegboyega Adesina. And I feel that these colors are slightly more vibrant and bolder, but I really feel like these colors kind of resemble the colors that would have been chosen by Pemba. And it definitely the kind of three works that are being presented in the auction. So that's what reminded me of it. But also it draws that similar kind of connection to Grandma and Child, where the subject is really looking at the audience rather than kind of looking away. So there's a really confident stance. And I think, again, it's just documenting people's moments in time and people just experiencing life as it is instead of it being kind of politically nuanced. And that, again, is a form of resistance art, because I don't think that sentiment has really changed. There's still that kind of expectation for artists, Black artists, to have some kind of opinion in their work. And for it to always somewhat be socially and politically driven. And sometimes it's just about technique and just being and depicting what it is that you want.
And your final choice that you wanted to talk about. And
yes, Zemba Luzamba, one of my favorites, from the DRC, but based here in Cape Town. A lot of his works are highly politically nuanced. And I remember when we were kind of engaging with Kimberley, she had a smile on her face when looking at it. So I'm interested to hear about her opinion about Zemba's works. But Zemba really, all his subjects are really dapper, really chic in style. And I think that's also an important thing to acknowledge, that Black people don't have to be presenting themselves as people who are only living in poverty. There's a richness to our culture, there's a richness to our lives, and that is demonstrated definitely in his works. But I think, again, this is like a bit of banter. There's two individuals are arm wrestling themselves, which is I guess something that maybe men do, but you know, there's a little bit of joy in there, and it's healthy competition. And I love these scenes, looking at Black individuals in a cohesive way, rather than just kind of placing or assigning certain opinions on them. And I think this allows this movement allows for people to really explore social commentary, rather than making it feel like it always has to be somehow assigned or rather aligned with any kind of political discussions.
Exactly. And I mean, even with the artists, Zemba Luzamba, I've definitely seen work that have come through our doors that have been political, social self-identity conversations, but then also speak to these everyday scenes, as you say, or people just living lives. And that actually just speaks to how humans have layers, to be corny, but and that's really what it's all done. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Annalisa. It's been an absolute pleasure sharing with you and your insight. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to move on to Monty, but thanks very much, Annalisa.
Thank you.
Montague Hermann, thank you very much for joining us all the way from USA. I know the time difference is quite big, and I'm really appreciative of you joining us in probably your lunch hour. Hi and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. We have a discussion around Sokoto that I'd like to have with you, in particular, Gerard Sokoto, who I think, in my opinion, in a way, of all the modernists we're talking about in this session, we are pinpointing this artist in a way feels and holds the most sort of traditional modernist style in a way, especially his blue period, which is the work that we do have on the sale, Woman Walking with Dog, which is a beautiful gouache on paper. And this work, as well as the artist, the artist has long been seen as an important South African artist, and his story is an artist in diaspora. And the fact that he longed to go to Paris to find inspiration in the city and collaborate with contemporaries at the time practicing there. But unfortunately, when he got there, it was actually very hard as a Black man in Paris, and he did not quite receive the strong reception and relationships that he had hoped for. And it was just as difficult to go back home, or even more so difficult to go back home to apartheid South Africa. So that is where he ended up living until his death. And his work has moved many over the world and is held in many museums and collections far and wide. And I want to ask you what your view as a contemporary curator specializing in African art, what are your views on his work?
Yeah, thanks. And excellent discussion so far. I think these presentations have been super informative and really thought-provoking. So thanks for all the other panelists too. I think with Sekoto, what I really love about his work is the kind of beautiful execution of social realism. It's not overtly political, at least not in all of the works, but it's imbued with so much nuance and suggestion about what's taking place in South Africa, particularly the works, from the 30s and the 40s. So it has this kind of defiance, but at the same time, it has this celebration of the kind of Black South African culture. And just a bit of a background, he was born in 1913. He's really credited to be one of the founding modernists of South Africa and, pretty much the entire continent. There was a show, and I think you might have referenced it in the beginning of the presentation, Leigh, the Short Century.
Yes.
That was held at PS1. Okwe and Wazor put that together, and you have Sekoto alongside Ernest Mancoba, and these are really kind of heralded as the two most important modern African painters of the 20th century coming from South Africa. And his work, his raison d'etre was to shed light in many ways, without being too activist, but it was to shed light on political and social injustice using that kind of social realism, whether it was tackling issues around poverty, corruption, racism, or just broadly the inequity of Black life in South Africa. And that really was something that he held to throughout his career, right? It started off early on, but after his departure to Europe, even back in the 70s, he was refocusing his lens on what was taking place in South Africa. And really, a lot of his most well-known paintings from the 30s and 40s depict that lived experience of his time in South Africa.
Yes.
And his own brand of figurative expressionism starts to evolve during that time, where he's really capturing that nuance. Again, what I was saying before about that defiance but celebration, where he was living in Sophiatown and Eastwood. But then ultimately, as you mentioned, he left for Paris in 1947. And I think it was under the guise of, creating a new adventure, a new life, where he would escape these stereotypes of apartheid South Africa. But upon arrival, realized it was much the same in terms of how he was engaged because of the color of his skin. And I think it was made clear historically that he turned to music and song as an outlet to find an alternate way to express himself during that period, and worked at a jazz club, wrote a bunch of songs and poetry. And actually the image that you used before this work, Women Walking with Dog, was, I believe, the self-portrait. So from the show that was put together by Stevenson and FNB Art Fair.
Yeah.
So take your road and travel along. I love that sentiment. I think that's such an interesting encapsulation of his experience, where he was constantly on this migratory path, trying to figure out where he belonged, where his identity kind of could be most heralded. And I think when we look at this 1973 work of Women Walking with the Dog, it's highly codified, right? It might be very subtle. It's from his so-called blue period, and you can feel there's this deep introspection. The work is very muted, but at the same time, you get this notion of, again, that social realism of him depicting his place in that context, right? I can only imagine Sekoto strolling around the streets of Paris, instead of capturing the energy and vitality. Oh, hi, sorry, on a phone call. Okay, so sorry about that.
Okay.
So yeah, instead of capturing the vitality and energy of South Africa in this instance, he's really capturing the vitality of a foreign place that has really strict forms of fashion and beauty. And I think this painting is, in some sense, a very global painting, and it's inspirational for any people who go to Paris and kind of have that experience as a foreigner coming into a foreign place with high hopes. In particular, given his background and given the struggles he was facing, it's very poetic in that sense for me.
Well, absolutely. And it also gives a context that I think people focus a lot on his early work, but I have a soft spot for his later work, actually, and some of the spaces and his love for that space himself, and that period is very interesting to me in his life. So I love this work, and when you see it in real life, you just see its softness and beauty. It's a really good work. Contemporary artists to look out for using the figure in art. That's what I wanted to ask you, and you've come up with some great examples.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, one of the reasons I started the gallery in 2019 was to focus on emerging and mid-career artists that I thought were bringing something new to the table. So I chose 3 different artists to share briefly today, and I know we're short on time, so I'll keep it short. But the first one is Beatrice Wanjiku. So she is based in Nairobi. And for me, her work is really that perfect blend of figurative and abstract expressionism, with a bit of surrealism in there as well. And she's really inspired by her personal narrative to explore the broader human condition. So a single woman, female artist, and not a mother in Kenya, she's completely bucked those conventional expectations in Kenyan society. And I think that experience for her is a jumping off point from which she starts to question broader societal expectations that society imposes on us. And she essentially rips them away. In some cases, she'll use this motif of a straitjacket that's very constrictive. In this work, you get this kind of spectral wraith-like figure that's coming out and is kind of reflective of our inner true selves. So she's really tackling how we can depict our identity, this kind of contemporary concept of figuration, in a way that's not about form, it's not about process. It's really taking the identity discussion and the kind of personal journey discussion to the next level.
Yeah.
Um,
I also love how it's taking figuration to the next level. It's really abstraction, borderline. Where do we draw the line between what is figure and art and what is not? And it's a really interesting inclusion. I really love how you've done that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think it really fits the mold and changes how we see it a little bit, which I love.
Yeah, very clever.
So the second work I wanted to share is from Wale Lagunju. He's from Osogbo, Nigeria. He studied at the University of Ife. He studied with artists like Victor Ekbuk, you might be familiar with, who also kind of takes traditional iconography and brings it into a contemporary space. He studied with Babatunde Lawal, who had a very strong opinion that we should be, as Nigerian culture, Nigerians should be seeing the Galete masquerade through a Nigerian-centric point of view and not a Western one. And around that time, he started to come up with his own form of Oneism, which is his revival of Yoruba art and culture. And what I think is really compelling about his work is that he's juxtaposing these Galete masks. And most of his work, you'll see Oba crowns or Galete masks. And he likes the notion of blending this masquerade, this kind of tradition and these artifacts with cultural iconographies from all these different time frames, whether it's Elizabethan era clothing, 50s bop culture from Americana. And I think when he does it, he's able to challenge historical understandings of what Yoruba culture is. So it's going back to that classical figuration and bringing it into the contemporary, but also challenging narratives around gender norms, power imbalances, etc. This work in particular is interesting because it's a hunter's mask. So you can't really see it in the slide, but the coiffure has a headlamp, and then there's some various animals there that are kind of intended to light your way as you go hunting into the forest. And it's always been worn by a very male-dominated figure, but he purposely juxtaposed that with a younger female portrait to kind of challenge our understanding of gender roles around work, etc. So again, I think an interesting way to take what was maybe seen as ethnographic for a long time.
And still is, I think, in some ways.
Probably still is, yeah, exactly. And then to bring it into the forefront to suggest that this is not a dead artifact. This is not something that can just be lumped into kind of a geographic area. It's a very personalized object that has interesting narratives and potential for contemporary exploration.
Absolutely. And your last example?
And so the last one, again, breaking the mold for me as well. This is Tamira Mejri from Tunisia, probably one of the most well-respected painters operating in Tunisia today. And he has his own form of deconstruction that's really inspired by David Lynch films, philosophers Jacques Lacan, Derrida, a bit of Picasso, and it's all centered around his concept of secular exorcism, where he essentially does lots of self-portraits. So in this sense, this is a figurative portrait where he's exploding the scenario so that you can extract societal constraints laid upon us by these commercial and political entities. So you'll see motifs of Nikes, for instance, or microphones or drones. The skull is kind of a reference to our vanity. It's just an interesting way for him to kind of speak to his personal experience in Tunisia, but also to kind of bridge that cultural divide using motif and recurring ideas and concepts that appeared in all different cultures. So I think he's really doing a great job of kind of connecting the dots, but also telling a very local story at the same time.
Yeah, I think your artists that you've chosen to share with us are 3 artists. I knew one of them, but all of them are moving strongly away from traditional definitions of art, let alone just the figure in art. And I think that's really, really interesting. And thank you very much for sharing.
Sure, yeah, my pleasure.
I think last but never least, Kimberley, thank you so much for joining us today. And I asked you to reflect on Irma Stern. I think welcome and thanks for waiting till the end.
I think it was worth it. That was amazing.
It has been an amazing conversation. I'm really enjoying it as well. I think I cannot really highlight modernist artists without talking about Irma Stern from a South African perspective. This particular work is a seminal work produced in 1938 during a very brief 4-week stay in Senegal, or what is now Senegal, in Dakar. And she met a woman selling fresh produce that helped her to find sitters and to paint. And we know of 4 works. This one, another one called Dakar Woman in Blue. There's one currently actually on exhibit and the Nobel Foundation on the exhibition that Carol Nels put together of Irma Stern and Zanzibar. And there's one at Ellerman House that I really recommend you go and have a look at. We also on the sale have beautiful examples of soft works of paintings of her work during this time, where she traveled quite extensively through what is now known as the DRC and also Zanzibar, but started off in Senegal, and people call it her golden age period of production. But it's also just a really interesting body of work to talk about, because it's also a period of bravery, a woman traveling in the 1930s to spaces that not people typically thought was a holiday resort, and trying to find spaces to paint and explore is a very interesting story as well in itself. And I think the type of work that she produced at the time is extraordinary. And she often looked at figures as a subject and almost obsessively sketched them, as you can see in these prints and etchings. And I just want to know from you, Kimberley, what do you believe the role and influence of Stern has had on the contemporary scene in South Africa?
Well, it's quite interesting. I think when I was sort of, I was looking at a particular artist in relation to Irma Stern, which we'll get to, but when I was doing a bit of research on this, I was quite fascinated to see how many artists actually spoke about Irma Stern as being really significant to their practice. There's many artists from the Bag Factory, just as an example, who were saying the style of her work, very much the richness of the color that she used was very influential to them. And I think in particular, I mean, I'm going to kind of segue my way into it, but it's beautiful to hear from the artists when they speak about her work in a contemporary setting. So like the way that Atipatra Ruga speaks about Irma Stern and has had this very, very long relationship with her work and has been quite seminal to his practice, is really a beautiful kind of way of then looking through their eyes into her practice.
So here's some installation shots of what you're referring to at the Irma Stern Museum.
So it's quite fortunate. This show is literally open to the public today. The timing is quite amazing for this talk. Yeah. And for anyone who's in Cape Town, I couldn't recommend the show highly enough. I really feel that this really is an expression of his heart, which, I mean, that's synonymous with his practice. He really gives so much of himself to this. But this show is such a fascinating dialogue between the two artists. And it's both a celebration of Irma Stern and the influence that she's had on his practice, but at the same time is also kind of a critique on her, which I think is really important. So I wanted to actually read something from the press release, because I like speaking directly from the artist. And Ati just said, "My Irma Stern interventions commenced with a copy of the Marion Arnold book, A Feast for the Eyes. I liberated a copy from the Cambridge High School Library in 1999, during which time I had started painting classes at Belgravia Art Centre in East London. The book, which was donated to the library in 1994 by a member of Parliament, has stayed on my drawing desk ever since. Its pages ooze rich colours and palpable surface textures, and to an extent, the publication also documents the antique clothing styles of Arabantu. It is said that you learn by copying the masters." And I thought that was really beautiful in kind of this body of work, but speaking to Ruga's practice as a whole. The work that you see, the tapestry piece here, that is a work from 2008, and it's a direct response to an Irma Stern painting. he calls it the Watusi Queen. And this kind of conversation and dialogue of kind of really taking it from the perspective of an African and looking at his own culture, and sort of in response to how Irma Stone was looking at it, you know, she was looking at it very much from a colonial lens. And within that, there's kind of like an ownership where within Ati's works, he's actually really interested in like the internal lives of his characters and the naming of his characters, whether they be fictional. You know, he has a whole story that he's created around this world of Azania and the lunar songbook cycle, but also looking at religious characters and real characters, and really giving them a strength through titling them, showing who they are. But there's like a real tenderness within these that I think is also expressive in Irma Stone's. It was a tenderness. She was really trying to encapsulate a beauty that she was seeing, that she was trying to expose the world to. And Ati's kind of trying to not just expose you to the aesthetic beauty of these characters he's portraying, but kind of their internal beauty and something within them. Another thing that Ati Petra Bruger had said was, I'm interested in creating work that is an encyclopedia and not just for entertainment purposes. So there is kind of, I think, Annalisa was sort of referring to this earlier, but there's this beautiful kind of sentiment in not showing these Black figures in pain and struggle. There's like a beautiful celebration and just in the everyday. And that is very much what this show is sort of looking at.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing, and I'm looking forward to going. I haven't had time yet because we've been focused on the sale, but I'll definitely go after. I want to ask you a similar question to what I asked Dana. Do you think the current contemporary trend of figuration is a fetishized theme when looking at the work on the continent?
I think I have a slightly different view in that I do think that there is a trend element to this. I don't think it's a fad. I think a fad would be to say it's to put it too far. And as we've all had in this very interesting panel discussion, we can see an incredible history of figuration. And that history of figuration also exists within the Western practice, you know. So there is a long global history around figuration. But I think it is important to note that there certainly is a lot of skepticism, not skepticism in the market, speculation in the market. And figurative work, particularly figurative work from the African continent, has fed into that. And we have seen that with prices going extreme on particular auctions. And it's mainly within that secondary market that we see this. Primary market, of course, has its moments, but like, for example, there was the Sotheby's sale that just happened, and I was interested to see an artist, Ishak Ishmael, whose sort of prices were looking, you know, the estimate was between 30 to 50,000 pounds, and the works actually went for about 270 something thousand pounds in the end. And they're a very different kind of figuration to what we've seen, but there is this kind of, when I was looking at the Sotheby's sale and as a whole, it was a lot of the figurative works tended to get a lot higher than their estimate. That's not to say that there's not an absolute sort of critical and curatorial presence within these artists' works. The practice is incredibly important, but it is, you know, as I suppose people working within this space, it's also important for us to acknowledge that there is this sort of speculative market that exists.
It's an interesting thing. Why are people so attracted to figures in art as buyers as well as artists producing them? And I think it's a conversation I wish we had more time for, because we don't. But I really like that you share that context. And I just want to say that at Strauss, that's exactly why we're doing something different with our education initiatives, as well as the way we are putting up our sales now, is because we want to unpack it a little bit differently, and we don't want to just follow the fad. We want to give it texture and richness and bolster the economy and the artists that produce on this continent, because that is why we're here and why we're passionate and what we're trying to do, and we have to do that together. So it's really great that all of you have joined us in this way. I just quickly, Kimberley, please tell me, what contemporary artists do you think we need to look out for that are using the figure in art?
Well, yeah, I'll give you like a quick overview. These are just, I'm a huge advocate for women artists. And so I went with an all-female sort of 3 choices of women who I just have a complete obsession with. And I chose them also because I thought they had a very interesting way of how they were responding to the Black female body in contemporary art. And in most cases, these artists have also used their own body as kind of this beautiful power, and this sort of critique of how it's this consumption of the Black body has been throughout history. So, for example, Kutsunai Violet Hwami, she uses a lot of sort of different mediums, you know, using family portraits and also images she finds on the internet, and then often her own sort of female form, often in the nude. I think there's an extreme power. She's such a young artist, so this is a really vulnerable space that she's putting herself into, and through that sort of, you know, just sort of forcing us to look at the layers of complexity around this. The other artist that I selected was one of my absolute favorites, Njideka Crosby. Hers are kind of looking at these sort of very intimate domestic scenes and sort of layered with her sort of Nigerian heritage and sort of very rooted in her culture. So even though she's been living in the US from, I think, the age of 16, she's very much rooted in her history and her family. And interestingly, you know, she married a white American, and she sort of is showing how there's this kind of the geographical tensions of the spaces that she is. I mean, I suppose the same as Kutsunai Violet Hwami is that there's this kind of dislocation of geography in the works, you know, having come from the African continent and sort of being part of this sort of Western society, but still being rooted into who you are and where you come from. So she sort of invites us into these beautiful, very intimate scenes. Mm. And then the last artist is Pamela Sundstrom, who shows with Goodman Gallery. She's absolutely just one of my favorite people, but also one of my favorite artists. And this work was from a show that Goodman had in London in 2020, which was such a joy in a time of so much strife for us to see this body of work. But Pamela was kind of really interested in, like, there's something sort of futuristic and ancient in the way that she sort of creates these mystical characters and figures. And there's very much like a post-colonial portraiture to this. But at the same time, what I thought was interesting in kind of relation to this whole topic we've been speaking of is that there's this, like, these intersectional conversations with like art historical works. So there's a lot of that kind of layering within that to kind of create something completely new. And I'll kind of leave it there because I think we're far over time.
Yes, thank you so much. And I was going to end and ask you quickly what you thought of this last question. I don't think we have much more time. We've gone well over the time just talking about the brief topics, and it's been such a rich webinar, and I have to thank you so much. But just quickly, I mean, I guess with a nod or a shake, do you think that figuration is an important part of an African art collection? And, you know, if anybody has anything to add before we close today, because unfortunately we are going to have to end a little early in our discussion. But thank you so much, Kimberley, Annalisa, Dana, Montague. You've been so generous with your knowledge and your time, and a lot of talking and a lot of engagement, and I really appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Leigh.
Pleasure. Thank you. I think we'll have to, I do see that we've got some comments just saying brilliant, well done. Thank you, everybody. No particular questions from our audience, but if you do have follow-up questions, please email them to us at Strauss and we will send them to our speakers. I'm going to let you all go. And have a good evening, everyone, and have a good afternoon, Montague.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Leigh.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
So much.
Have a good evening.
Okay, bye.